So, Jahal, I know you just voted for the first time a couple of weeks ago. Are you happy with the way that election turned out in Canada?
See, I knew we would have to talk about this eventually, but as you know, the Canadian election is it's over. That's what I can say. Are you very familiar with the results of Canada?
Unfortunately, I have not actually looked into them as much. I was getting some notifications last night just about like who is winning seats and what the projections were, and I checked in occasionally, but I haven't looked since last night. So I'm actually not really sure what ended up happening, but I hear that Trudeau has maintained power.
Yeah, he did maintain power, which is a victory for him. But see, I mean, the whole point of this project, the whole point of this election was, to his goal at least, right, was to try and obtain a majority in the government. So he basically needed to gain 17 more seats in parliament from what he had before, and well, he let's just say he didn't do that. Let's just say none of the other parties really did anything either. Like the results are almost identical. Like maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 seats difference between the various parties, but they're almost identical to what they were before. So this whole thing, was basically just a waste of time and money, especially during the critical period of COVID. So
It looks like on Wikipedia that no party gained more than 3 seats at all, which is very minuscule.
yeah,
And
yeah, Trudeau is set to gain 3 seats. Which I mean, it's whatever. 3 seats isn't going to make a difference, and it certainly didn't make a difference. He didn't get the majority. He didn't get the majority that he wanted. The Conservatives didn't, win outright. The Bloc Québécois, the Quebec Party, they didn't. Well, I guess they kind of achieved their goal. The NDP didn't, have bigger gains, and the Green Party didn't expand at all. So really, almost no party even got what they wanted either. So again,
right.
it just drills even harder the whole waste of time and money.
Functionally, what would have Trudeau gained having a majority in parliament versus what he is now?
Oh, everything. I mean, when you have right now, because to pass laws, to pass bills and everything, you have to have a majority. All of them are voted on, and of course you need a majority, right? So if you have a majority in parliament, that means you can, your party is able to just pass whatever bills it wants. So you don't need to convince other parties. But now because he doesn't have a majority, he needs to, sort of moderate his legislation to, have other parties on his side, whether it be with, the new Democratic Party, which is more progressive, or, with the Conservatives who are more conservative, of course. But, it's that's the whole reason why this election was called in the first place. Because Trudeau didn't have that. So he wanted to have that. And so he called an election. But now, Canada has firmly stated that we want, checks and balances, so to say, by not giving Justin Trudeau like a clear majority mandate.
Which it sounds like he's claiming he has based on his victory speech.
I mean, he's claiming that like Canadians have given him a clear mandate to continue what he's been doing, but which I guess it's true to an extent. But like, come on, you just wasted $660 million on an election which did literally nothing. So it's not the most exciting of things. Just
It does look like, according to Wikipedia, that the Green Party leader, Annamie Paul, lost her election. I don't know if that means. I don't know what that
yeah.
means functionally in terms of like her staying in power and whatnot, because she's lost before.
I mean,
But that seems like something
the
notable.
Green Party of Canada is really just sort of a fringe party at this point. It's funny with Annamie Paul especially, right? The leader of the Green Party in this election. the conventional wisdom of what people have been saying is that, before this election, before the election was called, there was so much infighting among the Green Party that people were saying that if this election were not called now, then she would have been kicked out of the leader position before, without even having the experience of an election. But, now that she's lost, that's just even more of a guarantee that she'll be kicked out of the leadership position. So there'll be another Green Party leadership election, yada yada. And for the other parties, who knows what's going to happen? They're not exactly super interesting either.
And it's interesting. It seems like, or maybe it's me just not knowing enough about Canadian politics, but she didn't appear to actually have a seat at all in Parliament. She was just running for one, and she didn't win it.
Yeah, she didn't have a seat in Parliament. She ran in a by-election. So when there's not an election and then somebody just resigns, there's a by-election to fill the seat. She ran in a by-election like a year ago, and she came in second, so she lost, but she was decently close. But this time, in the same riding, the same constituency, she came in fourth place. So that's like a very, very, very firm rejection.
And it looks like she only won 8.5% of the vote, preliminarily, which is not
fourth
good for her.
Place behind, all of the other major parties. So
one thing I heard about the election was that the People's Party was doing better than expected in Alberta, and I believe in Edmonton, which cost some of it may have cost the Conservative seats. I don't know how accurate that was, but it did look like the NDP got a seat in Edmonton or somewhere in Alberta.
I think they're saying that they cost like the Conservatives 3 seats in Alberta because of vote splitting, but it's not even if 100% of the People's Party is the far right sort of party, not really a factor in Canada. But, even if 100% of them had voted Conservative, right, the increase would only still have been, 5 seats, 6 seats. So not enough to take power remotely by any means. But it'll be, I guess interesting to see how things proceed. Are you able to feel my enthusiasm for this whole situation?
It feels like in general the election wasn't really as exciting or as hyped about as others that I would have.
Well, everybody other than Justin Trudeau did not want this election.
Yeah.
So, but in any case, this is a podcast about transit talk and not Canadian election 2021. Justin Trudeau tries to get a majority but fails talk. So. What are we talking about today?
Well, it's September, and it's been a while since we've done a transit review. And given that we've both been to some cities in the U.S., we do have common ground that we've both been to New York. And given that it is one of the most prominent subway systems, I would think it's a great time to do a transit review of New York specifically, and also of the outer line commuter rail networks too, because obviously New York's transit is not just the subway.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, the biggest city in the United States, financial center of arguably the world. Transit is also an experience, to say the least. So I mean, why don't we start off? Let's talk a little bit about our own experiences in New York. So I've been to New York City, I think 3 times, twice or thrice. I think thrice, yeah. So the first time wasn't really anything. I just took the subway round and round. The second time that I stayed there was for I think about a week or so. Yeah, a week or so. To attend summer camps. And so I also had a chance to ride the subway and walk around the city, get the feel for the place. And then the third time was during a long road trip. And so I stayed there, I think about 4 or 5 days. So not a long time, by any means, but
Mm-hmm.
I have had experience in New York City. I am aware of, I have had experience in the subway, and as well as of much of, the pros and the cons of the system and all the other transit systems, the commuter rails that are in New York City. But what about you?
I've been to New York 3 times.
Ah,
I first went in 2011 when I was pretty young, but I still remember most of that trip. We went with friends who were also the ones who took us to Europe on the private jet. So we stayed at
casually
a
drop that in.
well, it influenced the trip in that we would stay at a nicer hotel than we normally would, right by Central Park. So I was pretty close to the Columbus Circle and 59th Street stations, and most of what we did was, I guess, centered around there. We didn't really go out into the boroughs as much, but I came back in 2017 because my mom had work stuff to do in New York. So while I spent some of the days in her office, we still had a couple days to go around, and we stayed in Brooklyn that time, mostly because the hotels were cheaper, which was interesting because I'd never really been to that part of the city. So that obviously created a different experience because I spent more time in Brooklyn than I would otherwise. And then I went back, as we've talked about on this podcast. I was there in July for a couple days, visiting colleges, and we only ended up spending like less than 48 hours in the city, but I still had some transit experiences on the subway, and we went to a baseball game, which was something I hadn't done. At least a Yankees game, I'd never been there before, so that was interesting. So all three of my experiences, I guess, were different in their own ways. I believe 2011 was the trip I spent the most time in New York on, and unfortunately the one I remember the least about. But they're all memorable.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, of course, the pride of New York City's transit systems. Second oldest subway system in the world, actually. The New York City subway. When was it opened? Opened in
1904.
1904. That's right. So let's just start with some general opinions on that. How have your experiences been in the New York City subway?
My experience has been maybe mixed. It's certainly not the nicest or the cleanest
Oh,
or
that's
the most aesthetically
that's an
pleasing.
understatement.
It's I don't know that I'm the biggest fan of all of the stainless steel involved in building the rail cars, and the inability to walk between cars, which so many people constantly break every day. But it's obviously very extensive, and the frequencies are great. So from a ridership perspective and being a rider on it, it's nice that you can rely on it for the most part. But of course, there's plenty nicer around the world that are both just cleaner and use better rolling stock and are much better designed and whatnot. But it's I think it's great because it runs so far, and it gets the job done.
Yeah, I think, in terms of my own experience, coming from a place which doesn't have, subways at all, when I was in New York, it was like, oh my God, yeah, transit that runs all over the city, right? So it was an incredibly thrilling experience to be there. But, if I sort of step back and think about it objectively, especially when compared to, better transit systems elsewhere in the world, the problems are quite astounding. So I know, for example, the MTA, right? The agency that runs the New York subway, they have designated some problems as well, including, for example, overcrowding, flooding, which happens surprisingly often, especially during, storms and hurricanes, and, the aforementioned filth. It's absolutely not a secret that the New York City subway is astoundingly dirty, just trash strewn everywhere, and then rats. There's every now and then, an infamous New York City subway rat video goes viral across the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which it's honestly become sort of a symbol of the subway system in its own right. But in my own experience, I definitely agree that it's definitely good. The frequencies are absolutely amazing. the experience itself, though, is not so great because of the filth, but also because, when I was there during the summer, a lot of the stations and a lot of the train
They're just
cars,
so hot.
yeah, they don't have air conditioning. A lot of them, at least, which was
And the
horrible.
stations are even worse.
Oh yeah, no, I remember like it was like past midnight in a station, and then the station was super hot. The trains were going by because the trains, of course, they bring heat. The insides of the train are air conditioned, and it's the noise everywhere as well. It wasn't exactly pleasant. It was, but sort of the feel of the big city, eh?
And sometimes it's nice to kind of have that experience of like a dirty train or like the exhilaration of a
Right,
big city subway. But it's so endemic in New York, and it's widespread that sometimes it can just be too much.
right, absolutely. Um, Can I also another sort of big problem that I have with the New York City subway is like the super loud screeching noise of the rails. Have you experienced that before?
It's if to my memory, it's bad when the trains are pulling into the station, especially. Well, that's when you hear it for the most part, or if they're going by
Well,
or speeding through a
I mean, it
station.
was horrible for me because I remember like sometimes I remember like especially when not like the train rumbling, but like when they sort of stop or when they turn or whatever, and it's just the loud like metal on metal like screeching sounds, the
Mhm.
scraping sounds, and so I remember like vividly. I vividly remember like this one time I was stood outside of I think it was honestly Columbus Circle, um, but I was walking toward the entrance to the red line, the one train, and I even from the outside of the station, I heard the subway screeching noise, and I can remember just vividly thinking, like, oh my god, like if I were to experience this, twice a day, 3 times a day, every day of my life, then like my hearing would like just die after 5 years, 10 years, much less 60, 70. I'd go deaf pretty soon. So I did not find that aspect pleasant at all.
Well, and what's interesting is that the grinding of the wheels against the tracks also is really bad for air quality too. And there was an NYU study in February of 2021 that said the air quality in MTA and also past stations too is hazardous at times with the amount of PM2 from the wheels like grinding against the tracks
Oh
and
really?
releasing pollutants.
Really? I mean, I know that like for example, another other things that have gone viral include I think there's a few people who have actually tried to clean a few of the station floors or whatever, and they reveal like all the filth over the past like what 20, 50, 100 years. I know like that a lot of that stuff is like plain out, flat out hazardous to health. But I didn't think. I mean, the noise as well of the wheels.
Yeah, it's like the noise is bad and the air quality inside stations is bad. The air in the subway is actually quite nice because it's refreshed. It says 18 times an hour, but the stations themselves are not a good place to be.
Uh huh. Definitely. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember if I could tell a little anecdote of this one time of another experience that I had. Sorry, this is sort of back on the topic of rats, if possible. Um, I remember I was sitting at like I think the Columbia University station at like what 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and I was planning to take the train back to where I was staying, which is convenient because the trains run 24 hours in New York. But I just remember being tired and fatigued from a day of working or studying. I was just sitting there at the bench waiting for the next train to come in like 15 minutes or whatever. And I just remember, sitting at the seat, sitting on the bench by the wall. I can see like out by the further down on the platform, further up on the platform, closer to where the trains are. Just this humongous rat, like, and I swear it was about a foot long, just crawled out from somewhere, from behind a pillar or something, and I could just see it walking,
Damn.
walking. I could see it just going like along the platform. I could see it, going down and down the platform. And I remember, just thinking like, oh my God, am I dreaming? Like, is this real? Because, it's 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I'm fatigued after a day waiting in the New York City subway station. Nobody else is around. Is this really happening? Is there really like a foot-long rat which just crawled out from somewhere on the New York City subway and is just, waddling its way down the platform? I have no idea, but that is definitely, Columbia University should, in theory be one of the more upkept stations, but
Yeah, you would think.
But it's, yeah, rats. Moral of the story, rats.
And yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any experience with rats, and I did not see one when I was at the Columbia station. But
Maybe.
Clearly they are a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, were you there at 2:30 a.m.? Because I suppose that's probably when, the bulk of them actually come out.
Well, that's when most of the people aren't there.
Right, precisely.
So I guess maybe the rats become the waiting passengers.
Yeah. But in terms of, I guess we sort of bashed the New York City subway a bit, but definitely pros. Pros, as you mentioned, very, very extensive coverage, running all the length of Manhattan, lots of lines into the Bronx, lots of lines into Queens and Brooklyn as well. 24-hour service. The trains go to, a lot of places along as well. Yeah, any other pros that you'd like to mention?
Well, I think it's interesting that for a subway system that's developed really interdependent of one another, with maybe not interdependent, but there was essentially like two different operators to my knowledge. I think it was like the IRT and the BRT. Could be totally wrong, but it was developed largely separate of one another, with tracks not being really connected. And in large part, that's still the case today, with essentially sets of different numbers or letters together that all use the same tracks, but they're not connected. And for a city that's managed to have such unconnected networks, it's managed to do a really good job of connecting all of those lines together at transfer stations. Or I guess there are stations like Times Square where you have double platforms that allow for multiple lines to stop there without having to transfer to a different set of platforms. But overall, I'm very impressed at how they've managed to link a variety of different individual companies. It's like the Toei and Tokyo Metro, where they've managed to do a good job of connecting them, even though they use different sets of tracks. And obviously now it's all operated by the MTA, but at one point that was not the case.
Actually, can we talk about that point about, having multiple different lines come on the same platforms? What do you think about that? You think it's
I think it's necessary. Well, like, especially because in New York, most of the lines have express trains and local trains, and if you're trying to go from, say, Columbia University to, I don't know, Fulton Street, the express trains don't stop at Columbia University. So if you want to go south, you have to get off at, I think, 96th Street or something. And if you can just walk across the platform to the express train, that's really easy. And a lot of times that's actually what Japan does too. So if you want quick connections where you don't have to actually change platforms, I think it's necessary.
Yeah, let's talk about that as well, because to my knowledge, the New York City subway is the only one in the entirety of the United States which has this sort of system of local and express trains. The majority of systems in the U.S. and indeed around the world are, all the trains which go along the line stop at all stations, right? And then they come one by one by one by one by one. So, you look at, for example, BART, right? Which stops at all the stations in line with, rare exceptions. Or, for example, the Washington, D.C. or Boston subways, the trains stop at all stations on the line. What do you think of that? Because I think that system, at least when I first arrived, it was super confusing. Because
it is.
Because, the conventional knowledge, right, is that the conventional knowledge, and at least what I had thought in the first place, is that, you go to a station, right? You see it is part of this line, right? And you think, okay, if it's traveling in this direction, it must stop at all the stations. You see it's, red or green or whatever. And it goes, it's like, yes, my destination is also on the red or green or whatever line. And so you take the train down. But then, surprise, surprise, don't know that it's a local, it's an express train that actually doesn't stop where you want to go. It was super confusing the first time, and I actually had, had to waste a lot of time, like 20 minutes or something in like a station, just because I took an express train there, and the next one wasn't supposed to arrive for like another 20 minutes or so. But what do you think about this whole system?
I think it's good that at least, say for the green lines, I forget what their actual name, like the Park Avenue subway or whatever, the Lexington Avenue. Yeah, it would be way more confusing to have, say, like a 4 and a 4 express that come maybe like every 2 minutes, so like you could easily get on the wrong train. But at least it's nice that like every single 4 is going to be an express for the same stops, or every single 5 is going to make the same stops. So at least it's almost like there's just a variety of different services running on the same line, that I think is at least slightly less confusing than if you were to have different expresses for like the 4, or the different expresses for the 5. But the signs also do make it confusing about when express service runs. Like, is it late night, or which platform does it use, or which stops does it make?
Not to mention like if you want to differentiate between the different lines, you have to look on the map, and you can't look at only the station or what line it's on. You have to look underneath the station to see, underneath the station name on the map, to see, is it served by only express, or express and local, or whatever, right?
Right. And I think the maps are doing a better job, especially like if you're on a train, about which stops you're getting off at. And I think it's especially I mean, for me at least, I feel like I've been on the Lexington Avenue lines enough that I'm getting the hang of which streets are the biggest ones, or the express stops. But obviously for a tourist, it's going to be hard to figure that out.
Yeah,
quickly.
It's not beginner friendly at all. And speaking of beginner friendly, we're back on the negatives, but like another aspect of the New York City subway, which really struck me in the beginning as super confusing, is what you mentioned before, the whole concept of different lines stopping at the same station on the same platform. Yeah, that was super confusing for me when I see like, oh my god, there's 3 trains. If there's multiple platforms at a station, there's like, oh my god, 3-4 trains here. Some I have to go up the stairs and onto the other platform. Which one do I take? Which one is my train? How am I supposed to know this? Because, another thing that New York City is infamous for is, not being consistent. There may be multiple trains going in the same direction, but, you don't know. It's not, as easy as other systems where it's like, oh, there's two ends of the platform. One is going one direction and the other one is going the other direction.
Right. Some could very well be on the left side of the platform going I guess south, or like operating as if it was in like a Commonwealth country.
Yeah. Drive on the left.
You're right. It is it's not beginner friendly whatsoever, and I think the signage has improved. At least when I was there in the summer, it was fairly marked as to where you need to be, and I didn't have any problems getting on the right train. It was actually inconvenient that there was a lot of express trains that were just skipping an entire section of stops for track work, which is annoying. But besides that, I mean, the signage is improved, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, the signage has improved, but then again, there's also the other problem of and there's also numerous videos about this on the internet. But for example, 2 trains pull into the same platform going the same direction. Which one leaves first? Right? Again, it's not like other systems where the trains come one by one in succession, but there may be multiple trains of the same line in the same station, right, at different platforms. And it's just super confusing because, the first train that arrives is not necessarily the first train to depart again. Which, which sometimes leads to, for example, in New York, where people running across the platform trying to guess which train will leave first. But again, I don't think that's very beginner friendly either.
No, not at all. Especially like if one's an express train too and one's not. I mean, it might be marked, but you still have to figure that out too.
Yeah, but I guess I've also taken, for example, the Flushing line all the way down to its end. It's lots of the system are very crowded indeed. And there's not always air conditioning, so it's not, always a pleasant experience. Can get very tiring, especially if you're, finishing a day of work or school. But I will say, in my experience, for example, the benefits of the New York City subway is, again, it runs 24 hours a day, which means that when I was in New York City, I after studying for a super long day, I would get pretty hungry at night at 2 a.m. or whatever. And thankfully I could, since the subway's still running, I would just take the subway down to Midtown or downtown Manhattan and then get some nice New York City dollar pizza as a midnight snack, which was quite nice thanks to the subway.
Yeah, it's astounding that it's been able to run for 24 hours for so long, and also like maintain its ridership as well throughout that period. I do remember during COVID that it had cut its 24-hour service, and it upset a lot of people. So it's nice to see that that's returning and getting full use again.
Yeah, that was pretty funny because, it's another defining feature of New York. The New York subway, at least. We're proud, we're not Chicago or LA or Washington or whatever, but we run 24 hours a day. But like you said, it is returning back to normal, which is nice.
I guess before we move on from the subway, I do want to briefly mention its connections to the airports in New York, because they exist and are discussed. When you went to New York, did you ever use the subway to get from an airport?
The only airport I've ever been to in New York is Newark. So,
yeah, I guess in that case you can't use the subway.
Yeah, you can't really use the subway. But you've flown into New York, right?
I have, and I flew to JFK, but we took the more time efficient option, which is the Long Island Railroad. Boo. It is significantly cheaper to use the subway because the subway is only like $2.75 a person. I want to say, I could be totally wrong, but I think they might charge a bit extra if you were to use Howard Beach, or I guess it's the air train that's more expensive. The air train from JFK is really expensive. It's like $6 per person just to go to either Howard Beach or Jamaica, which is annoying. But the subway is consistently cheap. It's $2.75, so that would have been a lot cheaper compared to the $10 or $15 it was for the LIRR. But it does take a while to get from Howard Beach into the city, so it's not for everyone. And of course, you have to bring your luggage on board too.
But I mean, the air train to JFK Airport does serve. I just want to get this right. It serves Jamaica and Howard Beach. There's no connections to Newark from the New York City subway, obviously, but to LaGuardia, it's also just there's only buses to and from the subway station, right?
Yeah, and actually there's a lot of debate over that because there's been a lot of proposals to build an air train almost system that connects from the subway to the airport, and a lot of people have been critical about it, saying it's completely useless because it's not going to get enough ridership and it's extremely expensive. Because in reality, what's the difference between a transfer bus and a transfer train? I mean, people would probably use a train more, but in terms of what they offer, they're the same essentially.
I mean, at this rate, if New York cares about quality at all, they'll nuke LaGuardia and then build something from scratch there. Because
I've heard really good reviews actually about the new terminals that they're building. Of course, they literally have to rebuild everything, but They'll get there at some point.
I mean, I don't know. I only know about general like folklore and wisdom about LaGuardia, but I'd say if they were to nuke LaGuardia because it's too horrible, then they should probably nuke Newark as well because the New York City airports are not super pleasant to say the least.
Yeah, well, especially when I was at JFK, it's just so disconnected from everything. The air train is almost a necessity, but the air train in itself is also not very. It's not. It wasn't my favorite because you have to walk quite a distance from some of the stations to even get to the terminals. Whereas, I mean, the Terminal 5 for JetBlue was quite close to the station, but Terminal 4 was probably a 10-minute walk just to even get to the station from the terminal. So, I think the SFO air train is a lot better, but of course, it's amazing that you can have an air train that connects all the way out to Jamaica or Howard Beach. It's a bummer they charge for it, and I would wish it was free, but people still use it, and it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but actually, that's a good transition point to the next group of transit in New York City, which is all the commuter rail. So first of all, with the different systems, the most famous one, and the most utilized, in fact, of the New York City commuter rail systems is the Long Island Railroad, or the LIRR. Which you just said you took from JFK Airport into the city. So let's, why don't we start with that? How was that experience and your LIR experience in general?
It's decent. They have a variety of rolling stock that they use along the different lines, and it's also dual mode. So the train I was on was electric, but if you travel farther out on Long Island, they eventually run on diesel. But at least from Jamaica to New York, or to Penn Station specifically, there's a lot of service, and you can probably get a train close to every 10 to 15 minutes. So it's pretty convenient for coming from the airport, which is what we were using it for. And some of the services operate more locally and make like 4 or 5 stops in between Jamaica and Penn Station, and there's some that go with only some go nonstop, or some make one stop in like Woodside or Kew Gardens. But it's certainly good in terms of what's offered and how many services there are. The trains are nice on the inside. They're I guess standard commuter rail. It's like a 2-3 configuration, so it's a bit cramped, but they're modern. Most of the train cars are pretty new. Again, similar to the subway, they're all stainless steel, so they're not really the most aesthetically pleasing, and are still pretty reminiscent of like older commuter trains. But it works. It can be drab at times because it's kind of a boring single level stainless steel commuter train, but it's nice.
Yeah, and I presume there's not a lot of scenery in beautiful Long Island suburbia. Huh?
No, I was expecting kind of like a more urban vibe, and it kind of was like that, where you have some like more of the I guess the townhomes and the row houses and the elevated trains. So it was some of that, but it wasn't really that nice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've never been on the LIR just because I've never had any business on Long Island itself. But I mean, just looking at the map, it does seem to be pretty extensive as well. Just like how the New York City subway is with New York City in general. Long Island Road certainly does seem to cover a lot of different portions of Long Island, extending all the way to Montauk, all on the coast.
It is really extensive, and it would be cool if you could have just like an extensive network like this elsewhere. I mean, I guess Long Island is relatively highly populated and dense in places. Of course,
it's super
suburban,
dense,
but if we had train lines like this in like LA that ran as frequently as it did in New York, that'd be pretty nice. But I don't think we're gonna get that anytime soon.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like I know, especially as you get further east on Long Island, like closer to the Montauk area, it's really not the whole progression sort of goes from super dense urban core in downtown in Manhattan to pretty densely populated Brooklyn, to then vast suburbia in, further out east in Long Island, to then sparser and sparser and sparser populated suburbia. And then as you approach, the final segments of the Long Island Railroad, in all of the branches, to be honest, it honestly starts to approach a more, rural setting, as I've seen on the maps. There's not a lot of major settlements either. It caves to more, country parks and golf courses, and you start to get a view of the sea as well. So I think that's really interesting of how, even though you wouldn't really consider that to be New York City at all, you wouldn't consider that to really have any sort of connection with New York City in any shape or form, it's still served by the Long Island Railroad with a direct connection into downtown Manhattan, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, the Montauk line literally serves one of the richest parts of the country in the Hamptons, and to my knowledge, actually gets a fair amount of use from the people that live there, because it is only a 2.5 to 3 hour train ride, which in itself seems rather long, and for a system that's generally more of a commuter rail system, but I'm sure that people do commutes like that from time to time, especially maybe more closer to the I guess the Spionk area or the more central parts of Long Island. But it's interesting that there's still options to go from Montauk to Penn Station early in the morning.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, they all, early in the morning definitely. But then, all another thing which is sort of interesting is that like they all convene through Jamaica, except for one branch. One or two branches, but all of the major branches from the good chunk of Long Island all come in through Jamaica, and then they all go into New York Penn Station, which certainly, especially given its caliber, and especially given how New York Penn Station also serves a lot of commuter rails, and coming from a lot of commuter rails lines coming from the other direction in New Jersey, I haven't experienced before, but I'm sure that would make for a incredibly busy and, dare I say, congested sort of setting.
Yeah, well, and it does reflect in that, because the Long Island Railroad is the busiest commuter rail system in the country, and then the Metro North is the second busiest in the country, and I don't know if where New Jersey Transit stacks up on that list, but I believe it's certainly up there in the top 10.
Mm-hmm. But actually, speaking of Metro North, have you taken it before?
I have not. A couple people in my family have. I have seen it a lot. When I was at the New Haven train station for a couple hours, waiting for a train.
Oh.
So I saw some of the trains leave from there.
Did you not take the Metro North into New York City from New Haven?
No, well, that was this past summer. So we started in New York and we took the train to New Haven, but that was Amtrak, which is a lot quicker because the Metro North makes a lot of stops. It can take over 2 hours, but Amtrak's only about an hour and a half.
But still into New York City, yeah?
Yeah.
I see. But yeah, I mean, I guess, looking at the map, I've never been on it either, but it does definitely seem to serve its purpose of connecting the sort of mid-tier cities on the periphery of New York City, from Poughkeepsie and New Haven, the two big ones. Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like, a standard commuter rail line, one which, connects the richer suburbs, especially in Connecticut, down to New York City. What is interesting, though, is that almost all of the other commuter rail systems, including the ones in New Jersey and the Long Island Railroad, they all terminate in New York Penn Station, but the Metro North is the only one which still terminates in Grand Central Station in Manhattan. So I guess that's a little bit of fun trivia, eh?
Mm-hmm. I think there may be some reasoning for that, at least, because Penn Station requires trains to be fully electric, which makes sense because it's underground and it'd be terrible to have diesel trains running down there.
Hmm.
And since both the Hudson line and the Harlem line are still dual mode right now and run diesel trains for the bulk of the routes, I don't think they can actually use Penn Station legally. Of course, it would be harder for them to actually run into Penn Station because they have to adjust the route a bit. But Grand Central still allows diesel trains, which makes sense for Metro North because they still have to run a lot of diesel trains, especially on the Harlem line, which is fascinating how far it goes into the countryside and to some of the small towns. It literally has a station for the Appalachian Trail for hikers to get off at, which I think is
Oh,
interesting.
it does? Wait, which one?
It's near Wasaic. It's in well the line is also interesting because it stops at Southeast and then they have I guess a shuttle train that runs between Southeast and Wasaic because that line is so sparsely populated that they can't uh, run trains and expect to get full capacity all the way out to Wasaic. So they run some of these smaller shuttle trains just to connect into Southeast.
Huh. I'm just looking at this. I'm just looking at this on Google Maps right now. But yeah, it's what four stations from the terminus at Wasake, and the station is literally called Appalachian Trail. And wow, it's in the middle of nowhere.
Well, it's one of those stations that you have to request to get off at beforehand
Right.
because it's like really, it's like a wooden platform that only fits one of the doors. But it's interesting that it still serves the train.
Huh. That's really cool. And right from New York City too. Wow. Interesting. But I mean, yeah. What were you saying before about Grand Central and Penn? I mean, I guess maybe in the future we can see one mega New York City station if Grand Central ever closed. Um, because again, don't forget that not only does Penn serve all the other commuter rail lines, but it also serves Amtrak, which has a huge presence out of New York City. Um, but yeah, I guess that'll be interesting to see as well. Wow, this Appalachian Trail. I'm just looking at this Appalachian Trail station. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and also it is nice that in a city like New York, as compared to, I guess Chicago in particular, there is actually a connection, a transit connection between the two main stations. You can take the S shuttle between Grand Central and I guess Times Square, but then you can also transfer to Penn Station pretty easily. But you can't do that at all in other cities like Chicago, where you have like the OTC and Union Station just separate from one another.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like in Chicago where you have to walk. The only form of transit is to walk because they're not far enough to offer any sort of meaningful transit. But let's talk about the final set of commuter rails, which are all the ones in New Jersey. Let's ask, have you been on any of those before?
Unfortunately, I have not either. I've also it's similar to the Metro North. I've seen them quite a bit, and know what they look like on the inside because they're fairly similar to the MBTA bi-level trains that I've been on.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, I have not been on them. I have video clips of my brother riding on them, but I have not been on them myself. How about you? Have you
I
been
have
on
I have not because actually this one time I was close to because we were planning to to book a stay in Newark instead of in New York, and so that would have required me to take the PATH train, the Port Authority Trans Hudson into New York City, but we ended up getting a stay that was in just on Manhattan. So it's certainly much more closer to where the action is. But I want to talk about these lines in the context of their connections to New York. So, for example, with Path, right? There's four lines: red, green, blue, and red, green, yellow, and blue. And I think it's and there's really only two connections, two, shall we say, lines, two, what do you call them? Two crossings of the of the Hudson River from New Jersey into Manhattan. Two of the lines of the PATH trains terminate at the World Trade Center, and the other two go along a few stations along 9th, 14th, 23rd, and 33rd Street in New York, in sort of along the New York City subway stations as well. But I mean, in terms of all of these, right, this is sort of one thing which has always sort of struck me as being slightly odd, which is that, Manhattan, right, is of course, the center of everything. The center of New York City, the heart of New York City.
Right.
It's where all the action is. It's always surprised me of how relatively minuscule the number of connections across the Hudson River to and from New Jersey are. It's really only those two. Yeah.
They are, surprising to me, fairly well used. PATH has quite a bit of ridership, and it's one of the busiest commuter rail systems in the country, if you can call it a commuter rail system. Because it does, as this map shows, it goes out to Newark and it goes to World Trade Center, like you mentioned. But in addition to PATH, like you're right, you can only take Amtrak or New Jersey Transit across the Hudson. So there's really not a lot of options. But I guess those options can get you a lot of places. Of course, you can take Amtrak all the way south to Florida, or to New Orleans, or you can go up to the Northeast Corridor.
But I mean,
do they need other connections? I mean,
it's just always struck me as sort of odd because, you look at, for example, the East River, right, which has bountiful connections of Long Island Railroad and also the New York City subway. And then you look across the Hudson and there's really only 3 connections total, 2 of PATH and then 1 of New Jersey Transit, utilizing the same tunnel, the one that goes to Penn Station as well. Which I guess is definitely valuable because New Jersey Transit has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines that go into New York City, that go into Penn Station. So, so it's not like, New Jersey is deprived of direct connections to New York City. But it's just always surprised me, there's only one point of connection. For example, the area around Union City, across the Hudson River by the Upper West Side, there's just not really any transit connection there at all. You really have to, your only option is to go down south and then cross by New Jersey Transit or whatever into Manhattan. It's always sort of surprised me.
And the Lincoln Tunnel and the George Washington Bridge are always so heavily congested. They could easily build something just to mitigate that traffic, which, I mean, maybe it's interesting because a lot of some of the cities north of the George Washington Bridge are really affluent, and there's probably opposition to building a transit line under them. But I mean, again, maybe closer to Union City as possible.
But I mean, again, you if you've seen videos and the news likes to play a story about this every now and then because right, infrastructure bad, tends to get a lot of views. But the Lincoln Tunnel, right, especially the one that's used by trains, is just so dilapidated, so derelict. It hasn't undergone any sort of real renovation or upkeep in the past 100 years, which I think is just, a whole other reason to get more, find another solution, yeah?
Absolutely. And there's also just nothing in between the George Washington Bridge and the Cuomo Bridge. They could easily build another nicer tunnel that could funnel more traffic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or just build another bridge over the Lincoln Tunnel completely, if that's even a possibility.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, again, right, because talking about connections with New Jersey to New York, it's always seemed, also more inconvenient because, for example, from Manhattan, right? Like, let's say you're starting in Times Square or whatever, right? If you were to go from Times Square to downtown Flushing, right? It would cost you what? $2.75. $2.75. One plain subway ticket, right? If you were to go from, say, Times Square to Jersey City, which is about the same distance, really. It would cost you just so much more because I don't know the exact numbers. I think it's like $4-5 on path because the New York subway doesn't extend across the Hudson River into New Jersey. It's only path and New Jersey Transit which cross the river, which they don't they don't charge subway prices because they're not a subway system. They charge commuter rail prices, which I think just diminishes so much connection and so much possibility for development too, because surely a connection to Manhattan would be amazing for your own economic development, eh?
Yeah, it's just a bummer how they've, I guess, kind of botched that situation. I mean, Path is fine essentially in what it does, but I don't think it's great to have sole reliance on Path and then some New Jersey Transit trains that don't really run as often.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess there is the possibility of going all the way down to Staten Island and going completely around, and maybe taking a bus across into Elizabeth, but that would obviously be very inconvenient.
That would be horribly inconvenient. But I guess sort of you did bring that up, but sort of I guess as the last bit of mention that we should bring is the Staten Island Railroad. I guess keeping with the pattern. Have you had any experience with the Staten Island Railroad?
No, I have not.
No.
And I have never been to Staten Island.
Likewise.
So I don't really know actually much about it. I do hear that it's one of the more conservative parts of the state, which is, I guess, notable because it's in a super liberal city. But that's mostly all I know about it, except that this railroad doesn't really do much except serve people going between the island. But it does look like the one actually useful station would be the St. George station that serves the ferry. But that's what I can mostly get from it. How about you? Do you have any experience with it?
No, I've never been to Staten Island because who goes to Staten Island, right?
Yeah, you're right. Who does?
And yeah, you're right. Absolutely, that the only useful one is the St. George one that goes where the Staten Island ferry is. But I guess one. It always seems interesting when I look at the map. It's like, oh yeah, there's a huge subway line connecting the entirety of Staten Island. I almost said Subway Island there, Staten Island there, which I guess is wonderful for the affluent people who live along it. But I mean, I guess it'd be interesting to take it someday. What's also interesting is that they just decided to go right along this one line and not extend it anywhere else into, the entirety of the rest of Staten Island, especially up north. Which I guess would make sense, but it also doesn't make too much sense of why you would connect only this one line down the south to the ferry, when I would imagine that it would be better to have sort of more, maybe one or two other lines extending into Staten Island, but also connecting to the ferry. But I think I guess the one interesting thing to say about it is that fares are paid on entry and exit only at St. George and Tompkinsville, which are the first two stations by the ferry. And if you're taking the Staten Island Railroad, if they're not originating or terminating at one of those two stations, it's free, which is kind of dubious, but
I guess it makes sense though, because for the most part, I would imagine that's where most of its use comes from.
Right.
Especially as people transferring to the ferry, which we should point out is the busiest ferry especially busiest commuter ferry in the country. And actually, yeah, busiest in the United States and the world's busiest passenger only. We did have this debate on ferries recently, but when it comes to passenger only ferries, it is the busiest with 23.9 million riders in 2016. And it notes that it's popular among both the locals who obviously use it as a commute method to get to the city, which is obviously preferable than driving on the Verrazano Narrows
Oh
Bridge
yeah.
in heavy traffic and also heavy winds, which seems to sway the bridge a lot. But it also has a lot of popularity among tourists and visitors too, because of course, if when you take the ferry from Staten Island to New York, you go through a lot of the major tourist attraction areas, like by the Statue of Liberty and whatnot. So it's also very scenic.
Yeah, that's like the typical. I think that represents Staten Island super well. All the tour, you're on the sort of edge of just super world famous tourist destinations, and you get a ton of visitors. The only thing is, as soon as they get to you, they turn right back and take the ferry back to Manhattan, which I guess is how it. I guess is how it is. But yeah, I think yeah, that's about all the systems of New York that we've covered, eh?
Yeah, I guess the commuter rail is important. And maybe if we're on the topic of New Jersey Transit, it's worth pointing out that there is the random spur line from Atlantic City to Philadelphia that is not connected to any of the other train lines that even run into New York City. So it's interesting that there's no connection there, or I guess notable connection. But
Well, I
in
guess
reality,
I
yeah,
guess you can take the River Line from the the Atlantic City line to Trenton in New Jersey, and then take New Jersey Transit from there directly into New York Penn Station. But at that point, you'd be like spending like 30, like what, $40 on transit fees already. So maybe not be. It's probably not too much in the spirit of public transit. Eh?
yeah. I mean, it's doable.
Yeah, it's possible, maybe. But as we do in transit talk, we do assign the city overall, including all the systems themselves, the ease of connections, and the different options, a letter grade. So, with A plus being absolutely perfect and F minus being absolutely horrible, what grade would you give to the New York City area?
I would probably give it a B. I think most of the systems are pretty poorly designed and are dirty, and the stations aren't very attractive. But
Mm,
in terms of all of the cities in the U.S., none of the cities even come close to the amount of services offered and the amount of commuter rails you can take into every single part of the nearby states. And obviously, the subway going everywhere is great. So I think a B minus is good, because I mean I feel bad that I'm downgrading a system that is so extensive and has the most stations, I believe,
uh-huh.
but it needs work.
I think I would. Well, let's. I'm gonna compare New York City to the two other cities that we've done transfer review on before, which are San Francisco and Chicago. I think New York City is definitely better than San Francisco. Number one, because New York City has a wider extent of service. Number two, it is the times are certainly much better. New York City runs 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, BART shuts down at like what, 9 p.m. And then number
Hmm.
three, it is billions and billions times cheaper than the Bay Area Rapid Transit. Maybe it's not. It's probably not as clean, but then again, BART is not exactly super clean either. So I think New York City, well, I would put it above the San Francisco area. In terms of Chicago, I that's a good question because they're both pretty extensive. The Chicago Metro rails are very extensive into the Chicagoland suburbs. I would say, I would probably give New York City the slight edge over Chicago because, again, it does run 24 hours, but also because of the greater variety of options of the subway that is very extensive, um, as well as for example the ferry that we talked about, um, but also because of the fact that there's sort of a greater cohesiveness in New York City than in Chicago with its as we mentioned four different termini of a commuter rail.
Hmm.
Um, even though Chicago may be sort of more beginner friendly in terms of, oh, here's a train, right? It's going in this direction. It's on this line. It stops at it's going in this direction. It's going to stop at every station. Even though it may be more simpler, um, the price is about the same. And, I think as you mentioned, right, you do eventually get the hang of New York City. So I think I would give New York City probably on the border between a B plus and an A minus. I think that's where it would fall for me.
Interesting.
Yes, sir.
A wide disparity between our grades. Maybe mine's closer to a B, but still.
Maybe. Yeah.
I would say I think Chicago's better just because it's a lot cleaner and it runs really well for the most part. But
Well, actually, I actually,
there's
I actually took and I know we're getting close to time, but I actually took the Chicago subway. When I went to Mexico, so I had a sort of refresher on what it was like, and I was reminded of how unspecial, not super special it was. Um, it's definitely not the cleanest by any means, but then again, it does do its job. Um, but then again, all subways in the world sort of do their job. Um, but in any case, yeah. So we've had our chance to share our own respective New York experiences. Um, Obviously, New York City, right? There's a reason they call it the city that never sleeps. Whatever the name they call it, center of the world or whatever. I don't know, something, but it is certainly very rich in transit as well. We heavily bashed the New York City subway, but we also gave it not abysmal grades. But again, the only way to truly experience what it's like, all the facets, is to take it yourself. And hopefully, maybe you can be the next one as well to take out your phone at the right time and record a viral internet sensational video of a rat dragging a pizza down the stairs into the subway.